I have here a token of my esteem and regard.
You've given me quite enough presents.
Yes, but this is your birthday present. This must not be opened before midnight tomorrow night.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Christian Patouraux, founder and CEO of Kacific Broadband Satellites. And they're focused on the next generation broadband satellite committed to providing affordable high-speed broadband to Asia Pacific. Christian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me.
So you have been in the satellite industry for some 20 years or so, with companies such as MEASAT and O3b Networks and so forth. I'm very curious to know what led you to start Kacific, and what was that big opportunity that you saw in the market?
Well, I spent I guess from early 2000 to about 2010 as a business consultant in the industry when the broadcast industry was trying to reinvent itself into a broadband industry in the satellite business. And it was very interesting. It really showed that there's a very large market and a right to win for satellite in the broadband space. But unfortunately, many players in the industry didn't want to embrace broadband because broadcast was still very much the cash cow of the industry. So that led to a little bit of frustration over time for me. When I joined O3b, that was one of the company that started embracing broadband, but a bit in a different angle. So at one point I decided, well, a little bit with a push from friends, and because it was quite a daunting task to start a satellite operator from scratch. But I decided to take the step and to try to serve the unserved in the Pacific Islands and parts of Southeast Asia with a new satellite lineup dedicated to broadband.
So, well, let's first talk about what is Kacific Broadband Satellite specifically, and then talk about the kind of unique challenges of trying to provide coverage to these island-based nations. And I guess also apparently a lot of these areas are also mountainous as well, right?
Yeah. No. So Kacific is a satellite operator that now, after many years of development, finally operates its own satellites. We launched our Boeing 702 satellites in December 2019. It's entered service in March 2020, and its only and sole purpose is to provide internet to primarily rural communities of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. It is what is called a high throughput satellite, so designed around the broadband concept. Its whole architecture is designed to provide broadband, and it's built around 3 concepts. First, to provide internet with low cost of access, so small antennas, very nimble type of customer premise equipment. Second is high speed, so every time we deploy a service in a community or in an enterprise, it has to offer high speed in order for those users to really embrace the internet and fully use the internet. So, and the last concept is very much affordability, and that's very difficult to achieve because those populations that we cover are not the most affluent in the region, and the region is itself generally a developing region.
So let's kind of break this down a little bit. Can you go into the specifics of your satellites? What kind of constellation are we talking about, and what's the growth plan for the number of satellites to get the proper coverage? And when you say high speed, can you quantify that as well?
Right. So the satellite is a single satellite. I'm a strong believer in geostationary satellites as opposed to the new constellation that you see developing a lot around the world. I don't quite believe in those constellations as a provider of low-cost internet. They have their own attributes and specificities. But when it comes to connecting the developing world, the rural users of internet, a geostationary satellite is a lot more relevant. So the satellite, because it's geostationary, it stays at a fixed location in the sky, and therefore you don't have to use sophisticated ground equipment. You just put an antenna, a dish, and the dish stays pointed at the same location. And that is really important because those communities don't have a lot of money to pay for the customer equipment. Then the satellite is designed around the concept of frequency reuse. This concept is essentially a cellular network in space where you have a certain amount of spectrum that is given to you by regulators, and you want to use that spectrum as much as possible. So you reuse that spectrum in spot beams, essentially cells that are formed by the satellite. And thanks to that architecture, the satellite produces about 10 or 20 times more bandwidth, more usable broadband bandwidth than a regular broadcast satellite. That's essentially how the satellite is built. We've also partnered with another company from Japan to grow the satellite. So it was a company that needed their own equipment, their own business from space. They do broadcast from satellite. So they design their own payload on board the satellite. We design our own, and we develop what is called a condominium satellite. So it's like two payload in one satellite in order to grow the economies of scale of the satellite. So per unit, you therefore extract more bandwidth per dollar, if you want.
Yeah, it's very interesting in terms of the co-development of essentially creating those two-in-one satellite approach. Is that a fairly common approach? And certainly that cuts back on the CapEx. Does it have any type of potential interference or issues where you guys are operating in different frequencies?
No, because we use, I forgot to mention, we use Ka-band frequencies, which are very appropriate and suitable for broadband. The partner uses Ku-band, which is a little bit lower frequency, generally used for broadcast. So we don't interfere. And we developed our business plan independently, and they do a lot of mobility, a lot of broadcast. So it's not quite common. It complicates the deal, very quickly, exponentially, because you have to align your timing. Your business timing has to be the same. Your vantage point from space has to be the same. You want to address the same markets, because depending on where you put the satellite in space, you're going to see different markets. And just generally, you have to align the perspective from the two businesses to make sure that you don't step on each other's feet. So you don't have to feel a competitive pressure between the two partners. So it is very daunting, and at industrial level, the contracts that we have, the financing, the risk of completion has to be taken care of, and it's actually very challenging. It quickly becomes very challenging.
I can imagine. I want to briefly go back to your earlier comment about you don't believe necessarily in the lower orbit constellations that you're seeing, such as Starlink and many others that are striving, including Samsung and I think a few others as well. Now yours, of course, is at a much higher altitude, and therefore it's on a fixed position. But my understanding is that the higher you go up, I guess because you're further away from the terrestrial side, the strength and the speed is not as strong as if you're orbiting closer to Earth. But again, from a low cost supplier, it makes sense. But can you talk a little bit briefly about why you're not a big supporter of the lower orbit constellations?
Right. So it has very different attributes. In terms of power, in terms of speed, it's actually the same. The geostationary satellite can provide the same speed, the same power on the ground. What is different is what is called latency. So it's the round trip of a signal at light speed from the ground station to the satellite. The LEO constellation have a very, very short latency, so the system responds very quickly. But for most application on, for the internet, especially for the developing world and for remote villages, they use just the general internet. They use YouTube, they use, over-the-top video, they use Skype calls or whatever, video calls, and they just browse the internet. And for that, typically the system, the internet is tolerant up to about 1.5 seconds of latency. So you don't need to squeeze that latency down to a few milliseconds. Our satellite provides about 500 milliseconds, 550 milliseconds, which is way, way within the range of what these applications tolerate. In fact, you have the US Air Force that controls remote aircraft for surveillance or defense purposes with those geo satellites, so with that kind of latency. So even military applications don't require that kind of latency. So latency is a lot overrated today. What matters is, do you have the bandwidth you require to watch your YouTube and have the normal video? In fact, we could have had this video call, I should have done probably on a satellite link, and it wouldn't have changed. It wouldn't have changed anything. But however, those constellations, the advantage they have is that they cover the entire planet. So they are good for defense applications, for general mobility, connecting ships, connecting aircraft. But the downside of having that global connectivity is that you cannot put all your power, all your focus on a region. By default, as soon as you launch a LEO constellation, the satellite is going to revolve around the Earth, and those satellites are going to shoot by in the sky. Therefore, your ground system has to be adjusted and designed around these satellites that are moving in the sky, and those systems cost tens of thousands of dollars. Whereas the system that we develop with geo satellite, they cost only about $500 to $1,000 to connect an entire community. Those communities don't have $100,000 to connect their citizens.
Yeah, I think based on the latency, the bandwidth, and of course the capex as well as the opex, it makes a lot of sense in terms of your target segment of what Kacific is trying to do in the South Pacific, Southeast Asia. That the model that you have affords the lowest marginal cost, so that you can pass down essentially a low cost but still high value service to the consumers. What has been the receptivity so far, and then what's the kind of market reaction in terms of sign up?
Well, the reaction generally in the market has been extremely welcoming. There was no such thing, so there was no such offering for the rural end users or the remote end users, be it schools, hospitals, police station, government services in general, or remote enterprise, mining, plantations, etc. So they went. It was generally a quantum step from really nothing at all or very expensive satellites to something that looks like a broadband service that we have in the developed world. Generally a plan on a Kacific dish is something like 50 to 100 megabit per second. So people can completely embrace the internet. Because I'm a strong believer that there's only one internet. Either you use it or you don't use it. You don't have the internet for the poor or internet for the rich. You only have one internet. You have one YouTube, you have one Skype, you have one WhatsApp or one Zoom. It's only one internet. And people who don't have the bandwidth that they need to fully embrace the digital world just won't use the internet. They just feel like, well, it's too expensive or it's too slow and I won't use it. So generally what we have, because of those three elements of speed, low cost of access, and just low cost of bandwidth, together, we've started rolling out on a very high pace across 25 markets. Indonesia, Philippines, Papua New Guinea are the core of our market and are rolling out at a very high speed.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that I found out through some of the preparation for this is that it's amazing how something like the internet actually affects the movements of people. And I guess for some of these island nations and those that are in the kind of the South Pacific, they're looking for other opportunities, and that actually force them to leave the island to someplace else, maybe a bigger city, or maybe even a mainland type of a situation. So the internet actually allows for them to stay in the location that they're in, maintain their culture, and still be able to thrive and to create commerce. Is that really a true statement? And have you actually seen that materialize?
Yes, absolutely. What we've seen is actually at government level, they realize that connecting the villages leverage the infrastructure of the village themselves. So leverages the clinics, the health system of the village, and it doesn't necessarily medevac those patients at the first sign of illness to the main hospital. So that puts less stress on the central infrastructure of governments and keep people longer in their villages. It also fosters gender equality, because typically in these villages, when they have to choose a few kids to go to the higher education, they usually select the boys to go to the next step and go to the main city. But as the connectivity allows to educate the kids longer in their village, that means that girls are educated at a higher level as well before the segregation usually happens. So we've seen that generally. We've also seen that our services address the fundamental layer that we had not anticipated of life saving, especially, of course, for emergency services, disaster, but also connecting clinics where, in remote areas, first of all, medical staff wouldn't go and live because it was too dangerous to live there, because it's too precarious. You're not connected and you are in danger as soon as, you suffer an appendicitis, for instance. And also the local population is very quickly in danger at the first sign of an illness that could turn critical, or even in the childbirth phases or post-birth, that are usually critical. So we have seen a large number of life-saving events directly related to our connectivity.
Well, I know we don't have enough time to go into more detail, but I think there's a lot of kind of nuances around the complexities of running a satellite company, satellite operation, both in terms of launching it and getting a payload up into space, but also the maintenance and the ongoing aspect. I've been today joined by Christian Patouraux, who is the CEO of Kacific Broadband Satellite. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.